Was a man jumping out of your ear, little miniature man, oxidized the pants. Now, for a Christmas gift, I think you probably got one of these. I made my cowboy hat, the old cowboy hat I had, for me jumping out of your head. I did it flying, that took me. I made an umbrella that was, partially open, so all the pieces were just coming out, so it was like how can I put it, like a turbine almost at the top, it went down to the bottom. I made, I made the pins I made for graduation, the tragedy and comedy mask, and I put an emerald in it that I was trying to do, when I was in Columbia. I thought on the side I'll do emerald here, so I took a geology course on emeralds, and I found out that the Colombians can fake a three-way conclusion because that's oil, water, and a hard surface. I think diamond's only 2 ways or something. But so I put an emerald in each one of those. And then of course I made a pin for my daughter, and it was a cigar, and the smoke turned into a baby. The shape of a baby. Now, the artwork the Mountain Man has, because I had my art gallery in my card shop, so I had my whole wall covered in 70s cards, which was, a lot of Arete stuff, a lot of Vargas prints, that pop art, things taken out of context, cigarette pants with packages with cigarettes coming out of the back pocket, those straight leg pants. I have actually got the art I did in prison at the graphic shop where they shut us down because the guy was making the fake money. I actually have it in my room. And it's, we had graphic artists come in, and there's a lot of squeeze prints, there's woodcuts, there's doing transfers. We take National Geographic, and you can get 6 transfers because they use the clay base paint inside of it. I mean, none of it's any good. But I think that they were trying to tell our stories on art, just like we did in Theatre Street when we made them all make a mask and then put one of your dreams on the mask. And it's kind of a thing to delve inside yourself. It's a therapeutical thing that you think you're doing art, but really you're telling your story or getting something else out. Like if you were sexually abused, you might do something in that art world. In Theatre Street, art is a good way to look at your past in a perspective and maybe let something go. But the Mountain Man just liked all the color because people didn't. Cards were expensive. They were like $1.50. And also, you remember, I sent a lot of those cards to the canteen so I could trade, so I could save my employment wages to get the first TV with a headphone, right, black and white, $110, or $1.80 a day. If cigarettes are 65 cents, it'd take you a long time to save. They gave us that thinking nobody could save the money, but I did.
I'm Donna Spencer. I'm the artistic producer here at the Fire Hall, and I met Paul just after he graduated, I think, from Gordon Head, when he came over to Vancouver and wanted to do some plays, and there's a couple of them here before Station Street, so I'm really honored that we're here honoring him. And without further ado, I would like to turn the evening over to Mark Larignan, who's going to be your MC.
I was so thrilled when Donna made the offer to host this here. When Paul started doing theater in Vancouver, this was one of the first places that he showed up before Station Street happened. So this just felt right. And Donna doing this felt right. So thank you so much. Paul I'm going to mix up tenses all night, the most interesting human being I've ever met. I have been interviewing him almost since the day I met him. For 30 years, I've been asking him questions and writing stories about him. So I've kind of been his unofficial biographer for, wow, a very long time. And not only was that was one of the more recent interviews I did with him where I was asking him about his artwork. Now, Paul is actually not just with us, well, he's with us in spirit, but he's with us. He's right here. So Paul is the center stage where he belongs. And the way this is set up, kind of walking you through the magical mystery history tour that is Paul Crepeau's life. And wanted to start off with somebody who knew Paul pretty much before any of us except the family members who are here. Please welcome Jim Burns.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Mark. And it is great to see. I mean, it's so sad that you only see all these great people at these events. So let's make the most of it, okay? Yeah, I met Paul back in it would have been, I don't know, 1974 or 75, over in Victoria before he got into trouble. Well, we got into trouble, but and I have kind of racked my brain as to what I should do. But this is a song that goes back, you know, the thing, once I got to know Paul again after everything, and Paul was the guy that got me back on stage, because that's where I fell in love with performing. I did my first work in theater when I was like 12 years old, and then there were many years when I didn't have any work on stage, and Paul was the guy that had believed in me enough to get me back on stage, and I will love him forever for that, okay? But this is a song that I did, the very first professional gig I had where I had my name on the poster, and I was in the Union, would have been in November of 1965. And this was a song that I performed that night, and how a 17-year-old kid had any idea what any of this stuff meant. So it's kind of surreal, isn't it? When you're lost in the rain in Juarez, and it's Easter time too, and your gravity fails and negativity don't pull you through. Don't put on any airs when you're down on Rue Morgue Avenue. They got some hungry women there that really make a mess out of you. Now that you see Sweet Annie, please tell her thanks a lot. I cannot move, my fingers are all tied in a knot. I don't even have the strength to get up and take another shot. And my best friend, my doctor, won't even say what it is I got. Sweet Melinda, the peasants call her the goddess of gold. As she speaks good English, as she invites you up into her room, you're so kind and careful not to go to her too soon. And then she takes your voice and leaves you howling at the moon. Up on Housing Project Hill, it's either fortune or fame. You must pick one or the other, though neither of them are quite what they claim. And if you look get silly. Better go back from where you came, because the cops don't need you, but man, they expect the same. All the authorities, they just stand around and boast how they blackmailed the sergeant at arms into leaving his post and picking up Angel, who just arrived here from the coast, who looked so fine at first but left looking just like a ghost. I started out on Burgundy, but soon I hit the harder stuff. Everybody said they'd stand behind me when the game got rough. Guess the joke was on me. There wasn't nobody even there to bluff. I'm going back to New York City, Lord, I do believe I've had enough. I'm going back to New York City, Lord, Lord, I do believe I've had enough. Well, I don't know. And he told me, and I'm sure told you, many amazing stories about that. I was really thrilled that we have somebody here who's going to, I don't know, did you know Paul in prison or I know somebody who can speak to that world. And I'm not sure if they met in prison or after prison, but I know it's somebody Paul held very dear because he spent a very long time trying to bring his book to the big screen. The book is Jack Rabbit Patrol, and I'd like to introduce Stephen.
Thanks, Jim. Absolutely.
Thanks, Stephen. Good to see you, man.
Good to see you too. Right where he belongs, huh? I've had a very long and very painful relationship with Paul for a greater part of my adult life. And like many of you here tonight, I loved him. Loved who he was. And I've always described Paul as someone who's never been afraid of an idea. He started prison theater in prison. I don't know where else he started prison theater. But Paul and I have, we've gone through many things. When Mark played his little interview in the opening to this, I was just choked and listening to his voice. And I remember once a week, just like that. Oh no, and I put the phone down. Really deep sadness that I'm not going to get that. One night, I don't want to shock anybody here, but one night Paul and I, I don't want to shock anybody with Paul's drug use, but one night Paul and I, shock anybody with the knowledge that he did drugs, more than I did. He came out with me that night, and we decided we were going to get a hotel room because we needed a little bit of privacy, and make a bag of cocaine. Jane kept phoning us all night, and Paul was up for a part the next morning, this kind of bad boy part in the movie. He kept saying, "I'm rehearsing, Jane." I'm rehearsing, Jane. I never say you're wrong. I was reminded by a very sweet woman named Colleen. We were outside a little while ago. It's been involved a lot. How generous Paul was to all of us. Paul was very, very rare in that he wanted you to succeed. He didn't care who was involved in your project. He didn't care that he was not going to get credit for being anywhere, near your project or whatever it was you were doing. He just wanted art to succeed. And I think it's a message that we all have to remember. We get, in our, especially, in this, I'm from Victoria right now, in Haida Shore. In these smaller areas that we get, Vancouver's not small. These small areas that we get small sometimes with other people's successes. Gore Vidal says, not only must I succeed, my friends must fail. And I think we all have that in our heart at times, and Paul never, ever did. He loved this, he loved you guys, he loved this community, and he did everything that he had put into this community of arts in Vancouver, not just theater, but all arts. And I just love him so for it. I miss him. It was hard to hear his voice, but thank you for listening.
I was trying so hard to get a recording where you could actually hear him starting with the chain smoking. Because he would send me tapes when I would ask him questions, and they almost all started with right before he kicked off the answers. Now, I had to wear this shirt for tonight, my Vic shirt. And because switching over to the UVic part of his life. Somebody met him before UVic, but during prison, who worked with him, and I'm not sure what I can say without completely either embarrassing you or making you cry, but I'm going to anyway. Because this is somebody who Paul completely treasured, and we've talked about it, put on an absolute pedestal, because she was there believing in him when he was just starting theater, when he was just taking chances in prison, when he was putting himself out there for the first time. And we had these tremendous talks about, because the idea of Paul acting was such a weird thought because the way he mumbled. And we had conversations about the mumbling. I'm not sure how many of you know the reason for the mumbling was he said, well, if anybody was recording me, they couldn't see my lips moving. That's why they learned to mumble. He said it was a prison thing. So one of the people who taught Paul not to mumble and taught Paul to share his voice in the world. Please welcome John.
Hey, I wrote stuff down in case I was useless.
I think he'd be totally cool with sharing the stage with you anytime.
All right. What I'm going to speak about cannot be corroborated by doing a search on the internet. When I was about 22, in the early 80s, I was studying acting at UVic, and the head of the department at the time, Carl Hare, in his infinite wisdom, set up an arrangement with the nearby minimum security prison, William Head Penitentiary. William Head had started producing plays. The audience was bussed in through security. I think this was the second year of their arrangement with UVic's theater department. The deal was that the theater department would provide actors for the female roles in the prison productions. There are never enough roles for women at the university, and a male prison there are never any women. What could possibly go wrong? I don't know how long this arrangement continued, but I remember a couple of cool things from later productions. During blackouts, they would throw socks at the faces of the audience to freak them out. It was a very low-tech way to make people scream. After a production of Dracula at William Head, 2 inmates escaped to a swine vault across the water from the prison using a very well-built watertight coffin. Anyway, Vicky Daw and Wanda, fill in the last name I can't remember, and I were cast in an Agatha Christie murder mystery called 10 Little Indians. Instead of going to class, we were bussed out to the prison 2 or 3 times a week for rehearsal. So we were treated like gold at the prison. Vicky, Wanda, and myself, the inmates were showering us with compliments and favors and gifts. I remember a few steak dinners. It was pretty obvious we were the only women around and that they saw our presence as a tremendous opportunity. Coming from the theater department where there were only a couple of men, there was Pete, Graham, Sherry, and I was going to ask for a show of hands. Men from the UVic theater department. We have 2 tonight. Anyway, there weren't very many, so we were overwhelmed as women there. My character was Emily Brent, a repressed, judgmental, Bible-thumping spinster who spent all her stage time knitting a very long scarf. Paul's character was Fred Narracott, the boatman who delivers all the doomed guests to the island. It was his only appearance in the play, and it was the first time he had ever been in a play. The inmates were even more formal and polite with me than with Vicky and Wanda, because some of them who had not been around theater thought that I actually was a sexually repressed Bible-thumping spinster. During the run of the show, we stayed backstage once our character had died. We were hanging around for the curtain call. My character died about halfway through the show. Paul's character delivered the victims to the island, had a few lines. He had a few lines. And then he was backstage for basically the entire show. He was avid about his makeup and about saying his few lines perfectly. Other than that, he was backstage playing chess against himself. Off in a faraway corner of the room, he didn't engage in any of the wooing practices that the other inmates were doing. I had not actually spoken to him or officially met him until one day backstage I walked over to where he was playing chess against himself and asked if he wanted to play chess with me. He said, "Oh, no, you don't need to talk to me or anything, it's okay." And then there was a long pause, and he sort of looked at me and he said, "Unless you're into pity fucking."
other in the best possible light. And we all need people like that in our lives. Paul was obsessed with the craft of live theater from the moment he was introduced to it by this very silly play. Whatever he was obsessed with before this time, it was always theater after that. He wrote me letters from prison. This was back when people wrote letters. Describing plays he had read and plays he wanted to act in and direct and produce. He read about all the different methods of acting. He decided that I knew everything about theater and acting, so he asked my advice and took it about everything to do with theater. I started to teach him how to speak without mumbling. People from other countries learning English are always surprised that I understand what they're saying. It is because of years of trying to understand what Paul was saying. He was very close to his release time when we met, and he started studying theater at UVic right out of prison. Theater was his religion. He believed that it saved him from the path he had been on. He wanted to save others. He was determined to learn the craft as quickly as possible so he could start producing his own plays and running his own theater. He created Fenn Players. He produced shows in Victoria and then moved everything over to what would become the Station Street Arts Centre in Vancouver. I looked up the word impresario on the internet, and it said, see also entrepreneur, promoter, theater producer, artist manager, film producer. Paul knew how to make things happen, and he knew how to recognize the people who could realize his visions. Wherever other people may have seen him on the ladder of status in the Vancouver theater scene, he went directly for whatever he thought would be best. We need a good musician for a fundraiser, let's get Jim Burns. We want a really funny actress that everybody knows, let's get Nicola Cavendish. He drove most people around him crazy because almost everything he wanted to do was impossible. He did it anyway. Brian, Teresa, Carolyn, Caroline, Sparky, Eduardo. I know I'm missing lots of names. I think you remember helping to make many of these impossible events happen. His budgets only worked if we had a full house. He thought it was defeatist to think of it in any other way. We were housemates for a couple of years in the greenhouse, party house, that many of us lived in at different times. Paul put money into renovating the inside of it so that it looked beautiful and classy on the inside. He showed it to the landlord, who responded by raising the rent. And Paul agreed with him. I went on tour with the Story Theatre Company. It was my first theatre job after graduating. Paul gave me a really nice suitcase to use, but the most important thing he wanted me to know about this suitcase was that it was bulletproof. Riding in a car with him was terrifying. He gave Terry and I beautiful crystal wine glasses as a wedding present and told us how expensive they were, and that they were so we would have something beautiful and expensive to break when we were fighting. After I toured for 4 years and I was working at a health food store in Salt Spring Island, wondering what to do with the rest of my life, he phoned and told me he had the funding to run a theater program for street youth in the downtown east side out of his new space, and he wanted me to recruit for, build, and run this program. I said, I have no idea how to do that. Joni, you're the only person who can do this, you have to come! So Terry and I moved to Vancouver, and I learned how to do what I had no idea how to do. If Paul wasn't telling me I was amazing and could do anything, he was down the hall telling somebody else that I was amazing and could do anything. Some of the best fun I ever had was at Station Street with Paul and the gang, acting in a production of Beyond Mozambique directed by Alex Taylor, with Paul, Carolyn Beeler, Gary Sexton, Pete Lacroix, and Trevor, last name.
Lawrence.
Thank you. I got to direct him in a little play called Heroes. He played the Lone Ranger. Gary Sexton played Superman. Terry Sexton was Lois Lane. Sam Bob was Tonto. So much fun. He bussed my family and a bunch of other friends up to the Flying U Ranch when he started to run that, just to come for the weekend and see if the staff was up to snuff. We were his test guests. I'm almost done. Paul and I have not been in each other's lives for many years since he moved back to Saskatchewan. We have had the odd phone conversation and have been keeping tabs on each other on Facebook. He would send me his latest film or ask me about something that he wanted to clarify from the Hodge analysis that we all studied at UVic when we were directing. When the teachers were on strike, Paul sent me encouraging articles and quotes or things to make me laugh. He sent me little notes asking about how our kids were doing and would update me about how amazing his daughter Genevieve is. I noticed there was something more calm and focused in his communication of late, and when I saw his film about ADHD, I think I know why. I think he solved one of the biggest mysteries of his own life. Thank you for loving me so completely, Paul. Thank you for being my loyal partner in so many endeavors. Thank you for making so many remarkable things happen. Thank you for recognizing the talents in others and knowing how to bring them out. And I'm hoping you have joined us today because I would like to at least imagine that I can hear you laughing.
So proud of about Station Street when he opened Station Street. For those of you who don't know, Station Street wasn't Plan A. Plan A was he was going to buy the barge, I think, and he was going to do a floating theater, which is an awesome idea. He was going to compete with the Arts Club because he figured a floating theater would do that. So Station Street was second choice, but he kept buying things just in case he could get his hands on that barge. Kept buying lights and seats just in case. A story that he was so proud of about Station Street. He would talk about this actor who did this show at Station Street, this little show, and the actor told me he wasn't going to tell this story, so I said I was. The actor did this show at Station Street, and then suddenly he scored this huge gig in a Hollywood movie. And the actor came back to Paul and said, here's a check, I think it was for $1,000, the $1,000 he'd received as an actor at Station Street, and said, go, start somebody else's career. Please welcome John Cena.
I also have to write something because it's too much. Hi. I met Paul in about 1992 when I was about to do my first play there at Station Street. It was Italian-American Reconciliation by John Patrick Shalling. The beloved late Babs Chula was also in that production, as well as Glenn Cairns, who's sitting here somewhere. Glenn? Yeah, here. Hey, buddy. I haven't seen him in 15 years or so. And Mary Mancini and Sherry D. Wilson were in as well. Paul treated everyone with genuine respect, yet he was ferocious and protective of what he had created at Station Street. But never in a way that it was his, it was always ours. If you wanted to be part of it, you were a team player, you were in. You never felt that this was an ego trip for him. It was quite the opposite. He longed for collaboration. He sought it out. He put on plays actors were dying to do, and he gave you a shot at getting those parts. He attracted some of the most dedicated and talented actors in the city. I mean, everyone loved Station Street. In turn, I believe he had one of the best theaters in this town, or at that time in the country. The work I saw come out of that theater was continually at such a high level. And he wouldn't choose plays lightly. You would soon realize in rehearsal that Paul found a personal connection to any of the plays he was directing. He was relentless in the pursuit of exploring the play from an emotional and visceral perspective, but his text analysis was so detailed. He could tell you where the punctuation was in any given line. he knew the play he was directing inside out. In fact, he knew them so well that he memorized many of the lines, and he was ready to understudy you at a moment's notice. If you showed up with the sniffles one day, he would ask you how you were feeling with a little glint in his eye. Like he was ready to go on. We pretty much walked around in fear of getting sick. Many of his plays extended their runs due to audience members being great, and I had a sneaky suspicion that a lot of times he did it just so he could get a run at it. You know, he had lived the play as much as he could as a director, and then all that was missing for him was the need to experience it through a performance. So he was fearless. If he wasn't, like, being off book didn't faze him. He would sometimes, if he had to, go on stage with script in hand, with not a worry in the world. When Italian American was extended, I couldn't extend due to this film commitment that he mentioned, and he went on to play my role of Huey. And on closing night of my show, the cast of the movie I was doing came and they showed up for closing night. And one of those actors in the audience in the cast was Ethan Hawke. A few years later, I was in New York and I was watching a play that Ethan was in with his theater company. And over a few drinks, Ethan started to open up to me, and he revealed to me how inspired and impressed he was with Station Street, what was going on there, and how it had stuck with him. So of course, I instantly related to Paul, and it was just such a pleasure because Paul got such a kick out of people he respected, seeing his work, and just the back and forth. He was so proud of what he was building, and yet he was so humble. When I think of Paul, I also think of his chain smoking during rehearsals. He could never inhale deep enough. I don't know if you guys remember, but he used to kind of go. Like he he couldn't get it deep enough. It's how he approached life. He wanted it all, every last bit of it. I remember his pasta dinners at his house that would break into a rehearsal. He would do something he loved called the hot seat, and the actors in character would sit in a chair and be asked questions about their characters from the rest of the cast. His questions were always the most out there and yet so revealing once you had to think about an answer. And yet he would never hold you to that answer. He created a freedom inside you. When you would ask him a question, he would never answer it with absolutes. He always left it open. I remember him saying to me so many times, I don't know, what do you think? I would answer and he would say, maybe, with those sparkling eyes. He was always challenging his cast, challenging me to think outside the box. And yet he was doing this all without ego, without aggression. It was all about collaboration. I also remember him getting so excited with some of his rehearsal notes and not being able to read his own writing. I don't know if anybody's worked with him. He would write stuff down and then he'd be about to give you notes. He'd be like, and that note was kind of lost. He was fiercely loyal once you worked with him. He wanted to work with you again. When I moved to Los Angeles after Italian American, he would call me from time to time and ask me to do a particular play. Sometimes schedules wouldn't work, but the second play I did with him was called Beirut by Alan Baum. And it was a two-hander with a lovely actress named Lisa Crosado, who's not here, but I've been in touch with and she knows what's going on. This time, though, he would explain to me how he created a second stage inside Station Street, a smaller, more intimate space. It's where we would do Beirut, and we would end up doing another original play there as well, from a writer in town, Raoul Ingles, called For What We Reap. And at that time, For What We Reap was very risky in comparison to what was playing on stages around town, from what I understand, anyway, from what people were telling us. But not at Station Street, that's where it was happening. And it's why he opened up that smaller space. He was always pushing the envelope. And there were some dear friends in that cast. And I think like Nick Lee's here, and Ben Ratner is here. My brother Frank is here. And it was, quick story, we had this whole thing where, for whatever reason, the director decided that we would shoot like real blanks on stage with real sort of like charged blanks. And whenever that scene would happen, where my brother Frank would end up killing everybody, the place would just be engulfed in smoke. And so it was so thick, and it created a very creative, created a very surreal environment. It was great for the play, and the music was playing. Everybody was freaked out because it was like, it's a fire hazard, and you can't do this, and the cops are gonna come. But Paul was like, no, it's good, let's do it. And like, he's the artistic director of the space, and he's the one who's pushing us to kind of break the rules. In Beirut, the play had some nudity, and it was a very intimate space, and I talked to Lisa last week, and I asked her, anything you want to say about Paul that I can relay. And she said the thing that stood out for her most about Paul was how he had taken such good care of her regarding all of that nudity stuff, how he never cracked a joke about it, how he treated it with respect, and was adamant that everyone else do the same. It meant a lot to her. That was Paul. The culture and environment Paul created was one that you felt at home. You felt loved, you felt respected and safe, and yet when you walked in there, you were ready to work. There was an energy that just enveloped you as you entered. And then it got better. The theater now had 2 stages. It had 2 plays most nights. Scattered times, a bar in the lobby to talk shop all night and decompress after the show, together as a company. And I remember when I was doing Beirut, in the larger theater was Beggars in the House of Plenty, with Vince Gale and Nancy Seaback and some other really wonderful actors. And I remember just being astounded at the incredible work they were doing and becoming friends with them. And it was just such a great feeling of community. And our common thread was our love for theater and our love for Paul. Outside of Paul's artistic integrity, which was, I think, uncompromising, what always touched me the most about Paul was his kindness. Paul was one of the kindest people I'd ever known. He could lose his shit, especially when someone betrayed his trust, like the theater getting robbed and all of its equipment, which I remember happening twice, actually. There were many who took advantage of Paul over some of those years, and it's why many of us felt so protective of him. As street smart as he was, as intelligent as he was still a babe in the woods in some ways. A child, but it was the child in him, and I think we all gravitated to. I loved Paul. I had not seen him over the years as our lives took their various paths, but I always held him and will continue to hold him dear in my heart as someone who was instrumental in my development as an artist and as a person. He was a rare breed in this business and in this world. He really walked the walk. A couple of years ago, Mark Laren Young asked me if I wanted to develop and produce a film on Paul's life with him. His prison days and how he fell in love with theater in prison. It was a no-brainer for me. I was in immediately. This got me back in touch with Paul from time to time when we would trade emails about the various stages of the script. And when Paul died so suddenly, I was in shock. I looked back at my last email exchange with him, and this is what it read. John, had a dream about you and Frank and your 2 kids doing a film together sometime in the future. Bizarre. It was like seeing you old and young at the same time. Read lots about your opening, congrats. Check out my update on Talking Heads on Indiegogo. There's a short film on the project. Tell me what you think. I want to tour it in its next stage. I read the, and this is regarding the film, I read the new draft, like night and day, really good, made me cry. So that gave me some peace, because I know Mark and I now are more committed than ever to bring his story to the screen, and to know that his last draft, just, I will say beautifully written by Mark, was approved by him, well, it meant the world to me, and I know it means the world to Mark. To know that he felt that we were honoring his story, that we were bringing something to life through collaboration, creating art without ego. That's who Paul will always be to me. A true artist and a dear, kind man. Thank you.
When John was talking about Paul fearlessly risking those fire regulations and things like that, I wanted to point out that two of the people who were always holding their breath behind the scenes and making sure the building didn't go up in flames are here tonight, and are the two people who made sure that this happened from behind the scenes. Brian Pike over there, and when we started talking about this, they said, sure, we'll do all this, but you're the one who has to stand on stage. John raised nudity. I think one of my favorite Paul stories was I was assistant directing a production of Cold Comfort starring Margaret Langrick, Maggie Langrick. And she has an extended nude scene in a tub and was very nervous about doing this. I don't know if Maggie's here tonight, so if you're here, I'm stealing your story. But she had an extended nude scene in a tub, and Paul was trying to figure out how he was going to do this so she felt comfortable. We did conversations, we weren't quite sure what to do. And I was away that day, so I heard about it later. What happened was the day she was supposed to do the nude scene, the two actors and Paul showed up naked. And straight for her. Mark, did I get that right? Yep. And after that, she was laughing so hard she felt just fine. Now, we've got another person here who wants to talk specifically about the Theatre Street program. And there's one thing I wanted to say about the Theatre Street program and why Paul was so proud of it. Jane Mundy, who's also out there somewhere, wave, smile, hey Jane, was running a company called Real Appetites with Paul behind the scenes, catering company in Vancouver. Yes, applause is good. Showed up tonight and helped make food happen out there. And when Paul would talk about Theatre Street, he said that the thing that mattered most about the program wasn't the theater. The thing that mattered most about the program was the fact that they were taking the leftovers from the film sets to the Theatre Street kids and making sure that no matter what, every time those kids came into the theater, they got a hot meal. And that was a true story too.
I love Paul. I'm glad, and like my friend Paul, I'm a grateful recovering alcoholic and addict. And like you guys, I'm grieving the loss of a friend. I first met Paul in the early 90s. Joan had just left Theatre Street, and I had just moved back from the East Coast. And Paul had done Cold Comfort here, and I just done it out in Halifax. And I thought, well, I better go meet this guy. And so I went in thinking, maybe I'll get a directing gig. So I sat down and met with Paul, and he just wasn't buying it. And he was letting me listen to me, and you know, yeah. And after a while, he says, "You have a criminal record?" I thought, fuck. Good question. I said, no. And he says, oh, I think we have something for you. We need somebody who can sign the grant application. So began 2 years of the most insanely creative time in my life. It was certifiably bananas, Brian. I ended up directing Paul in the small space, which it was so bizarre because the stuff in the main space, which was 150 seats, that was designed to be pulled apart in 2 hours in case the landlord decided to come down. And the work on the main stage was really dark and edgy, and Paul still needed a second stage, right? So we ended up doing another Jim Gerard play. I don't know if you guys know Gerard's work, but it's structured in real time. So it's really slow, and there's not a lot of talking, and it's extremely violent. And this production involved a high-stakes poker game, a lot of booze, and some really graphic spousal abuse. And we just got pasted by the critics for it, who were really disapproving that we would present such a thing. But what happened was we got a letter shortly after the show closed, just a short note from a woman who'd come to see the show and gone home and packed her bags and moved into a women's shelter. And Paul was so deeply moved. He said, that's why we do what we do. So that, you know, Paul always had a huge heart. And what really, really was important to him was those kids. Those kids, go find a bunch of fucked up kids and bring them in here, and we'll feed them and give them a safe place to play. And he said, but don't do any fucking social work with them. Give them a parallel experience. That was his thing, a parallel experience where they won't know that they're actually working out what they need to work out. So lots of conflict with adults or conflict with authority, and we did an insane production of Uburua, Alpha Jari. It's still pretty scandalous, you know, 120 years later. The kids just rocked it, and they ended up writing their own stuff. And I'm still in touch with Andy Matovich, who is now. Andy was this pumped out, long-haired, geeky guy, and I got him purple mohawk, and I got him in a tutu, and Doc Martin's playing Mrs. Ubu. And Andy's in China. He's the manager of some language school in China, and he's thriving, and he's got a brush cut, and he looks like a businessman. And, you know, that's one of the things that art can do tangentially, is change people's lives. And Paul changed my life profoundly. I've never been embarrassed about the kind of criminal aspect of it, because unlike most of the Fenn people, I didn't get my criminal record till after I worked at Station. And contrary to popular belief, I met a Paul hater a couple months ago, still holding a grudge 20-some years later, and I felt sorry for her. But contrary to popular belief, Station Street was not a front for a cocaine dealing syndicate. There was no money. It ran on passion. The sets cost $1.99. You paid, borrowed, or acquired. And I want to talk about payday, Fridays. Paul would always disappear. He was never there for me. And we were so broke. I think we were making $140 a week. And one day, Brian would often go track him down. One week it was my turn. Fuck, I went last week. You go get it. I think I borrowed a buck from Brian, so I could afford to take a bus. And I tracked Paul down, and I found him at home, and he was there with Jane, and he was having a couple of drinks, and he looks at me, and I said, well, you know, it's payday, man. We're hungry. I had to borrow money from Brian to get the bus up here. He looks at me and he says, fuck, I should never have rented that Miata. I was like, I'm fucking of split it up at the office, and that was it for the week. So yeah, it was a profoundly life-changing time. And I think maybe it's just me being nostalgic, but I think that kind of passion has been lost a little bit in the theater. I don't know, I see it in the young companies, in the marginalized companies. I don't see it so much anymore. That willingness to take chances on people. Paul, unlike a lot of artistic directors, actually read scripts that were submitted. He produced one of my plays with the magnificent Jim Burns, Kim Condershaw, Carmen Moore, who was just a beginner at the time, and Diane Brown. And he took chances on people. He really did. He was an edgy guy, and he would extend his trust. And once he did that for you, he expected it back. And he pushed us hard, but he never pushed us any harder than he was willing to push himself. And he was an inspiring guy. And I guess the last thing I want to talk about is the fundraisers. I posted on somebody's Facebook thing that for this we needed DOA to be the house band. And the place had to get robbed. The fundraisers. I think that was at 6 robberies. One night, like I'm a really gentle, peaceful guy, and one night we got DOA was in play this booze can fundraiser, and we were short. Which?
It was the Grubaholics.
Well, it was the Grubaholics. Yes, well, Paul hands me a hammer, and he says, "What's that for?" And he says, "Go stand at the back door. If any of those fuckers try to get in for free, hit them." So
I still have not forgiven you for that.
Anyway, I loved him, and our conversations over the last years were about recovery. Primarily about recovery. When I went into recovery, I put my creative life aside because I was scared that it would pull me back into the craziness. And I'm at a point now where I'm ready to get back on the horse. But Paul didn't put his creativity aside. He just kept it right front and center. And we used to talk because he hated meetings. He just hated 12-step. And he said, "Oh, fucking people, Jesus." And he did it, you know. He got himself clean, and he stayed clean for 5 years, maybe a little more. And it's just... I'm going to miss him. But we've got his films, which are really... The last one is, he sent it to me. It was like spending an hour with an old friend. It's so beautiful. Anyway, that's enough out of me.
Now going back to the University of Victoria, I'd like to welcome Cherny.
Thoughts would flow, love and strength of one, and we're crying in the cover of the evening sun. Tomorrow's rain will wash the pain away, but something in our hearts will always stay. Perhaps this final act was meant to be for us how he came and went. nothing comes, if nothing spent, and nothing ever will. For those of us born beneath the moon and stars, lest we forget how fragile we are. On and on the rain will fall, like tears from the stars, like tears from the stars. On and on the rain will say, how fragile we are, how fragile we are. Thoughts would flow from love and strength on one, and we're crying in the cover of the evening sun. Tomorrow's rain will wash the pain away, but something in our hearts will always stay.
When Joe was talking about the second stage, I don't know how many of you heard the end of Station Street story, which was that Paul applied for a Canada Council grant, and he had a season that I think had like 15 plays in it. And the Canada Council said, that's insane. You can't possibly do 15 plays. Like, you don't know. Now, one of the people who was on second stage worked in those plays with Paul. Please welcome Vince Gill.
Hi, I'm Vince Gale. I had the great pleasure of working with Paul a few times as he helped my company produce shows at Station Street, and I worked with him as an actor, and he was my director. And we did a show. The first time I worked with him, we did a show called Beggars in the House of Plenty. And Paul had great taste for great writing, and just thinking about that show, I came across a speech from it, and I'd like to read that. It's a great piece of writing. What's the matter with you? What's the matter with your soul? We could have helped each other, Pop. The world's hard enough, ain't it, without no haven at all? As I look like the Bronx inside, and I could vomit up a burning car, you see them, these dead wrecks everywhere. They've been abandoned, and I feel them inside. And I was the lucky one. I was the fortunate son. What have you done to me? What have you done to your boys? You know what I feel when I see a beggar on the street? I want to kick his face. I want to beat him to death because that's me, pathetically waiting with my frickin' cup. But that's over now because I've stopped stealing, and I've stopped setting fires, and I've stopped breaking windows. And now I'm going to stop waiting for you to reach down and to touch my face, to kiss my wounds. There's been a kind of silence fallen between us like a long drop onto sharp rocks for a long time now. It's been my wait. I've been waiting for something. Words, I guess. Some words. Do I have the words even now? I will never think of you without being shocked by your lovelessness. I will never think of you without a gasp of wonder, and I will never think of you without some pain. And despite everything, in the face of everything, though it personally shames me to say it, I still have love for you. That's no indication of how I felt about Paul. Great. I met Paul in the summer of 1992, and he was casting a new show by John Patrick Shannon called Beggars in the House of Plenty. Paul was a collaborator. He let me in on every part of the creative process, casting, design. He wanted input. He took ideas from everywhere. It was a way of working that I dreamed of. It was immersive, it was consuming and perfect. Paul introduced me to Babs Chula. I read with her and lots of other good actors for the role of Ma in Beggars in the House of Plenty, and to me it was clear that Babs needed to play this role, but Paul was reluctant. He wrestled with the decision. He said, "Oh, Babs is so much work. She makes it so hard." And he was right, because she did, but in the best way. And then I introduced Paul to my friend Nancy Seaback in the hopes that he would cast her as my sister. And after a full day of auditions, I asked him what he was thinking, and he instantly replied, "Well, it has to be Nancy." You know, Paul and I did Beggars in the House of Plenty, and we did a new Sam Shepard play that year called States of Shock as an actor and director. And then later that season, he rented my company, Station Street, to do a production of Jim Cartwright's The Road. It was a big, big production. It was a big, big cast, and it cost us a ton of money, and nobody came, and Paul didn't charge us rent. He wanted Station Street to be a hub for the arts. He wanted it animated. He wanted it alive. I saw everybody that I wanted to work with, either on that stage or in the bar. Duncan Fraser, David King, Jim Burns, Guillermo Verdecchia, Tamsin Kelsey, Nikki Cavendish, Bill McDonald, Al Willows, Benny, Johnny, Frankie Bones, Nick Lee, Jilly, Nano, Babs, and the list goes on. Paul and Station Street introduced me to the theater community. I consider the work I did with Paul 23 years ago seminal. It was where I learned to be an actor, to work with a company, where I learned that life is too short to only work with the people that you want and need to. Paul was a creative force. He was a creative leader. When I think of Paul, I'm vividly reminded of a huge group of actors, designers, and creators who he worked with and nurtured. I believe that Paul's gift was that he brought together great people to tell deep, connected, visceral stories, the stories of our time and of his time. Thank you.
When word went out this was happening, I got a great email from Colleen Fee, who's over there. And she was talking about Paul and how possessive he was of the talent he worked with. And when he played with somebody, he declared them his geniuses. And I'm looking out and going, oh my God, it's like all of his geniuses are here. It's fantastic. Please welcome Darren.
Phew, this is how it ends up, huh? Wow. I did a couple of plays with Paul many years ago, but I'm quite amazed that when Jim's speaking and all you guys who have known Paul for so much longer, I wish I got that time, because I only met Paul in the early 90s. And the first play I did with him, it was my first time I actually got paid to do a play. And as I recall, Paul did show up on Friday. He did get paid. It was American Buffalo with Al Willows, who I saw here. And one of the things I vividly remember about, well, a couple of them. One is that Ben Griffin just brought this to my attention. I didn't know, but the whole time we were rehearsing the play, long before rehearsals started, and during rehearsals, and during the whole run, I didn't wash my costume. I was playing Bobby this junkie, so I thought it would be good to have a filthy, disgusting, sweaty costume. And every day, you know, my lunch would go into the costume, and cigarettes and ashes and whatever. And what I didn't know is the whole time Stephen Demopoulos, who was playing Teach, was complaining emphatically to Paul that you've got to get this kid to wash his clothes. Paul never said a word to me. Paul never said a word to me. And the dressing room was very small, and I remember one night Stephen came up to me just before we went on, and he said, "Ben, can't you just act that you stink?" Another thing I remember about that is that we all knew from the beginning of the run that Al Willows was going to be leaving before a closing night because he was doing another play out of town. So Paul was going to get his chance to understudy the great role of Donnie.
And I was just new at this, and I didn't know why Al and Steve kept asking Paul if he was off book, if he was learning his lines. You off book? And Paul said, oh, yeah, no problem. The off book, the off book, they kept asking, and you can see where this is going. When it was Paul's time to get up there and do our closing night show, he was not off book at all. Not at all. And as I recall, watching Paul, it's not only was he not off book, but Paul was not a good reader. So watching Paul look at that script on stage in front of an audience, to me, as I recall, looked like a guy like driving 100 miles an hour down a highway in a hailstorm with no windshield. It's just, you can't even see the guy. But he did it. He did it, which is remarkable and incredible, and he did the show. And after the show, I was pissed off, and I thought, that ain't right. You don't get a paying audience and read a script in front of them badly. And I just didn't know any better. You know, I didn't know that, you know, there would be no play, there would be no Station Street. I wouldn't be standing there without everything Paul did leading up to that train wreck. So I wanted to give him a piece of my mind after the show and just say, what's the matter with you? And Paul, when he saw me in the dressing room, he gave me a big hug, and he was just on fire. He was so happy. And he just told me how amazing the show was, and how great I was, and how great Steve was. And it was the greatest night he's ever had in his life, and he just loved it. And I started believing it. I really did. And then when we walked out into the lobby, I think the audience believed him too. He had that same passion. And that's such an important I'm so glad I met the guy. Because, and I didn't even realize this, you know, I haven't talked to Paul for years. I would, but I couldn't find him on Facebook because he spelled his name wrong. But it's such an important lesson that Paul taught me, and I didn't even know it, but he taught me never choose perfection over passion. Never. I will never choose to be on stage with somebody who's perfect and doesn't care over somebody who's a disaster and has invested every atom, every molecule in their body and their heart and soul into the play. And that was Paul for me as a mentor. The next play I did with Paul was, he was acting this time, and he was off book, very well off book. And it was a play written by Frank Borg, who Paul met in prison, called The Chalk Player. And Paul was playing my dad. And rehearsals were kind of hard. Our original director, Duncan, had to leave because he had another engagement came up. And we had a new director, is Tammy here? Tammy, it was her first play. And I think she was pretty nervous. And she was directing a play for two guys who just got out of jail. You know, Paul and Frank. And we were rehearsing one day, and we were stuck on a scene, and it was a scene in which I was playing this kid who Paul, my dad, had kept me locked up in his basement for my whole life, grooming me to be a professional gambler, a chalk player. And we couldn't get anywhere with the scene, and we were just flailing. And it was going on and on and on. Paul wouldn't get out of his chair. And we all were just going, just say your lines. And he wouldn't say his goddamn lines. He just went, no, it's not right, it's not right. And he wouldn't look up, and he was so stubborn. We were all getting pissed off, and Suzanne Ristic was playing my mom. And this is how I remember it, Suzanne. I know you're here somewhere. If maybe you have a different memory. This is how I remember it. And it was so frustrating. And he just wouldn't say his goddamn lines. And he just was pouting, and he was like petulant. You know, as I remember, Paul could be such a little child sometimes, and he just wouldn't, you know, he was like this. And finally, after what seemed like hours, we started saying the lines, and the scene just happened, and it just fell out of our minds. We just said the words, and we were doing it. And you know, it's a lot of actors here, and we live for those moments when you don't have to try, and you just start talking, and your body starts moving, and it's just happening. And it was just happening. And Paul was sitting there in that chair, and I was telling him off as only a son who is leaving his father, who's in prison here his whole life would. And Paul sat there, and he looked so sad, and his body was just slumped down, his shoulders were slumped down, all life was drained out of his body. He just sat there and looked at me. And I looked over at Suzanne, I turned around, she was standing there, and she was just beaming at me. She was so proud, and it was one of those things that I just felt like I was on strings, you know, like on Peter Pan. And I just flew across our little rehearsal stage into her arms, and we embraced, and off I went to live the rest of my life as this guy Belmont does. And, you know, I've been, like a lot of you guys, been acting for about 25 years or something like that, and I still, that's like the top 3, like maybe top 1 of a moment of just being an actor and just going, that's why I do this. Because Paul taught me in that moment, you know, something that a writer, John Steinbeck, said, don't be seduced into thinking something is without value because it doesn't turn a profit. The value of a moment like that in an artist's life, and hopefully we get to share that with an audience, far surpasses, you know, just banging out the schlock for a good paycheck. And that's what Paul was about, and that would have never happened without Paul. So I'm very grateful to him for that. I'm trying to remember this quote. Who was it, Jen? Camus. There's this quote that really made me think of Paul, and working with Paul. And it says, don't walk in front, some of you may know this, don't walk in front of me, I may not follow. Don't walk behind me, I may not lead. Just walk beside me and be my friend. That's working with Paul. He just got a friend beside him. And Paul, sorry it was a short walk. Should have been a longer walk, but it was a good walk. And the rest of us here are going to keep on walking through it. So thank you.
Okay, so we're not mentioning this guy, all of this.
I'm not going to say a word because something's going to happen on the screen.
want to say something?
Yeah.
Okay, Duncan Fraser.
Hey.
One of my favorite actors on the planet.
Before I ever got to Station Street, I was in lovely City Stage and went off Station Street and taken over from City Stage and did the same kind of gritty, down-to-earth, often unwelcome stuff that the rest of the theaters in Vancouver were still wallowing around doing English sitcoms. Nobody's right there. So I took to it, and Paul took me on to do Gone the Burning Sun, which is an hour and a half soliloquy. And as you can imagine, I was pretty nervous. And during the course of rehearsals, we had 2 fire scares. And it came to the preview, my only preview, after only about a week and a half rehearsal, an hour and 3/4, remember. And I was as nervous as hell. And I stepped on stage and the lights came up and they immediately went off. And I thought, okay, well, let's start again. And then the sirens came. And Paul jumped up and said, "Oh, fuck, we're on fire." So I said, okay, where's the extinguishers? He said, "Fuck if I know." So we ran around the place in the dark, because the fire chief had turned off the whole block. Ran around in the dark, feeling the walls, the fire extinguisher. But we never did, and we spent the rest of the evening outside in the freezing cold, smoking dope. And no, it was my first experience with Paul, who said to me, I said, how much you going to pay me? He said, well, minimum. Now let me tell you something. He said, I've had arrangements with people before. He said, we went through this mumbo jumbo. Frankly, I couldn't tell a bloody word he said. Due to my heritage, I have watched a lot of people eat porridge. I've never quite seen the reverse process, but that's what watching Paul talk is like. It's like, the reverse of somebody eating porridge. And it took me a long time to get used to it. I'd say, what did you just say? And he'd say, I don't know. We just leave it at that. Anyway, there was some probably rather illegal business went on, and I never did get paid for that show. And the next one I was to direct Savage in Limbo, and I directed that, and he was in it, and he was bloody good too. And I never got paid for that either. And unlike what Ben said, I was to direct the shotgun, and I actually started directing that show. I directed it for a couple of days. I'm getting a bit fed up with this, and finally I said to Paul, come on man, this is 3 times now. You've got to start paying. Give me something. He said, I've got something for you. I said, oh great. He said, come along, you can have dinner with us. Okay, this is it. So I had dinner with Jane and Paul, very nice. And by that time we were all of us about 3 sheets doing. And I said, well, come on, what is it? What you got for me? And he waved his arm. And surrounding the kitchen that we were in were these kitchen cabinets. They were hideous. He said, you can have them. kitchen. He said, I did. Yeah, they never knew I was going to come next. The thing that I admired about him was, like many people have said here tonight, was his absolutely raw enthusiasm for the art. You don't come across that in the professional world very often. So I think somebody else said tonight, and it's true. It's usually due to things like ego or money or something. But not that matter. He was just voracious in his appetite for theatre. And I found inspiration from that. That's why I stuck with him such a long time to try to understand him. And the other one was his love for his daughter, Jean-Pierre. And he went through a very, which you probably know, a very heartbreaking time trying to keep a hold of that little girl. And it broke my heart, actually, to see him try. And through it all, you know, he kept a smile on his face, and he kept that feeling that there was nothing in the world that was impossible if he could put his mind to it. And by God, he proved it a couple of times. We should have all that.
Yeah.
Which is that while the fire hall generously donated the space, there are some expenses, so he will be passing the head outside. Am I in trouble still? No. Excellent. So I've shared that. Anybody else wanted to come up and say a few words? Okay. So this will be our last speaker for obvious reasons. I'd like to, and then I'm going to say more stuff. But Renee Crepeau. Paul's sister.
Thanks, everybody, for coming. Mark, Brian, and Eduardo, and Jane, and Carol, for helping do everything. Food, really appreciate it. Sorry. This has been overwhelming. It's beautiful. One thing I can remember Paul saying is jet pilots never have fewer mirrors. Godspeed that way. He'd be so touched by everybody being here. You know, I just want to thank you.
From people who couldn't make it out. First from Richard Ladd. Yeah, Richard. I, like many theater artists in Vancouver in the early 90s, owe my formative artistic growth to Paul Crepeau. He took a warehouse space and made it into a theater complex. In a city limited by underfunding and commercial-based theater, Paul and the Station Street Arts Centre was an oasis for new writers, producers, singers, dancers, comedians, dreamers. Paul didn't say no, he said when. Whatever the idea, he loved it. His eyes sparkled with enthusiasm whenever you pitched a project at him. The last thing on his mind was the rent. We'll work something out, was his usual response to how a show would be financed. And Brian's over there nodding. Then he would get back to talking about what the show would look like, sound like, feel like. I can remember how we managed to get through it all. I don't remember how we managed to get through it all financially. I just remember the shows. I adapted Oscar Wilde stories for children's theater. I had 3 or 4 of my original plays produced there. When my crew of rebellious theater comrades asked if we could do a men's festival at Station Street, he just walked over to the big calendar taped to the wall board in his office and said, pick a date. We didn't know there would be doors closed to us later in life because Paul never closed any to us. He really loved putting on plays, and he really loved the people who did it with him. I heard once that when he began rehearsal for a play, The script had my name listed in the original production cast. Paul said, "Is that my Richard Lett?" When he asked me to write the screenplay of one of his films, Jackrabbit Parole, about criminals and bank robberies, I said to him, "You know, Paul, I'm not sure I'm the right guy for this. I'm not a criminal." He said, "Did you ever sell drugs?" As I stumbled for an answer, he said, "It's a yes or no question." And he laughed. He gave me my start along with so many others. He gave me the start so I could give others their start. He led by example. It was not uncommon to see him at the top of the ladder or with his head under a sink and then rush off to a meeting with city planners or funding boards. He believed in people and took pride in them. When I heard he passed, I had to sit for a bit and be grateful for him and what he had meant to me and so many others. Yes, I was definitely his Richard Lett. He had a sharp mind, a great eye, a crazy laugh, and a big heart. Did I love him? It's a yes or no question. The answer is yes. Thanks, Paul, for all you gave me. I'll never forget you, Richard Lett. This is from his sister, Nana, who's in Shanghai. I think that one of his gifts is to make very close, very intimate connections to others. He treasured deep connections to others and was passionate about art and truth. In order to make that happen, one must be very open to others, and so one always risks getting burned. He consciously chose to live that authentic life, risking failure or hurt in order to have what he really valued. To the end, he cherished his relationships, his theater skills, and his filmmaking. I miss the long talk scene I had very regularly. I'm glad I had the chance to do for him at the end, and I'd rather that he'd flame out than fade away. But I miss him.